Picture this. You're scrolling through history books, and you stumble across a record that makes your jaw drop. An emperor who claimed to have intimate relations with over 3,000 women. Not in his lifetime, in just a few years of his reign. You think it's a typo, but then you dig deeper and realize this was just Tuesday for some of history's most powerful rulers. Welcome back to the channel, where we dive into the wildest, most unbelievable stories from history that they definitely didn't teach you in school. Today, we're pulling back the silk curtains on royal harems, those mysterious, forbidden worlds where emperors, sultans, and kings lived out fantasies that would make modern billionaires blush. But here's the thing. This isn't just about lust and excess. These harems were political powerhouses, economic engines, and the source of some of the most dramatic palace intrigue you've ever heard. We're talking assassination plots, mother-in-law wars that lasted decades, and women who went from peasants to literally ruling empires. So buckle up, because we're about to explore a world where having 1,000 wives was considered modest, where entire cities were built just to house one man's romantic interests, and where the phrase, "it's complicated," doesn't even begin to cover it. Let's start with something that'll blow your mind right off the bat. When we talk about royal harems, most people think of the Ottoman Empire, maybe some Arabian Nights fantasy stuff. But the reality? Way more intense, way more complex, and happening literally everywhere powerful men had, well, power. The word harem comes from the Arabic haram, meaning forbidden or sacred. And that's exactly what these places were. Forbidden cities within cities. Sacred spaces where only the most trusted servants could enter, and where some of the most powerful women in history lived, schemed, and occasionally ruled entire empires from behind silk curtains. Now, before we get into the jaw-dropping numbers, let's talk about what these places actually were. Imagine a luxury resort, a political think tank, a university, and a small city all rolled into one. That's a royal harem. These weren't just bedrooms. They were sprawling complexes with gardens, libraries, schools, hospitals, and enough staff to run a small country. Take the Topkapi Palace in Istanbul. The harem there housed up to 4,000 people at its peak. 4,000! We're talking about a population bigger than most medieval towns, all dedicated to serving one sultan's personal life. There were dormitories for different ranks of women, apartments for favorites, schools where young girls learned everything from music to mathematics, and even a hospital with its own medical staff. But here's where it gets really wild. These weren't just pleasure palaces. They were serious political institutions. The women in these harems weren't passive prisoners waiting around looking pretty. Many of them were brilliant political strategists, economists, and power brokers who influenced everything from trade deals to military campaigns. The hierarchy was mind-blowing. At the bottom, you had the newest arrivals, often gifts from conquered territories or purchased from slave markets. Sounds horrible, right? But here's the twist. For many of these women, entering a royal harem was like winning the ancient world's lottery. They went from poverty to luxury, from illiteracy to education, from having no rights to potentially wielding enormous influence. Above them were the trained concubines, women who'd spent years learning arts, languages, music, and the subtle art of court politics. Then came the favorites, women who'd caught the ruler's eye and earned special privileges. And at the very top, the Queen Mother, who often held more real power than most government ministers. The Mughal Empire in India took this to another level entirely. Emperor Akbar's harem reportedly contained women from dozens of different cultures and religions. Hindu princesses, Christian Portuguese nobles, Islamic scholars' daughters, Buddhist temple dancers. It was like the United Nations, but with way more drama and significantly higher stakes. And the money involved? Absolutely staggering. The Ottoman Sultan's harem consumed roughly 1/3 of the empire's entire budget at its peak. We're talking about millions of dollars in today's money, spent annually on clothes, food, entertainment, education, and maintaining these massive complexes. But here's what's really fascinating. Many of these harems developed their own economies. Women inside would run businesses, invest in trade ventures, and accumulate personal wealth. Some became so rich they funded major construction projects, including mosques, schools, and hospitals that still stand today. The education system within harems was often more advanced than what was available to most men in the outside world. Women learned multiple languages, studied poetry and literature, mastered complex musical instruments, and received training in everything from astronomy to accounting. The Ottoman harem had its own library with thousands of books in dozens of languages. This wasn't just about creating the perfect companion for a powerful man, though that was certainly part of it. These institutions were creating some of the most educated, politically savvy women in the world. And when some of these women eventually gained positions of real power, they used these skills to reshape empires. The daily routine was structured like a combination of finishing school and military training. Morning lessons in languages and arts, afternoon instruction in court etiquette and politics, evening entertainment and cultural activities. It was intense, competitive, and absolutely cutthroat. Because here's the thing nobody talks about. For every woman who rose to become a favorite or queen, hundreds remained in the background. The competition was fierce, the stakes were life-changing, and the politics made modern reality TV look like a children's tea party. So when we talk about an emperor sleeping with 3,000 women, we're not just talking about some ancient playboy's adventures. We're talking about a complex social institution that shaped politics, culture, and economics across multiple civilizations for over 1,000 years. All right, time to meet our main character, the emperor whose bedroom activities literally became the stuff of legend. We're talking about Emperor Yang of Sui, who ruled China from 604 to 618 CE, and whose appetite for women was so legendary that historians are still arguing about whether the numbers are even physically possible. But here's the kicker. Yang wasn't even the most extreme example. He's just the one with the best record keeping. This guy maintained detailed logs of his romantic encounters like he was tracking military campaigns. And in a way, he kind of was. Yang inherited the Sui dynasty from his father, along with an already massive harem. But apparently, Daddy's collection wasn't nearly enough. Within the first year of his reign, Yang had expanded his harem to include over 3,000 women. Not 3,000 total, 3,000 new additions. The guy was basically collecting women like other people collect trading cards. Now you might be thinking, okay, but how do we know he actually slept with all of them? Great question. Palace records, my friend. The imperial secretaries kept track of everything, and I mean everything. They recorded which women the emperor visited, how long he stayed, and even rated the encounters. Yeah, ancient China had performance reviews for royal hookups. The bureaucracy was real. According to these records, Yang claimed to have intimate relations with a different woman every single night for over 8 years. Do the math. That's roughly 3,000 women. But wait, it gets crazier. On special occasions, festival nights, and during certain celebrations, the records show he would sometimes spend time with multiple partners in a single evening. The logistics alone are mind-boggling. Yang's harem wasn't just in one palace. It was spread across multiple locations throughout the empire. He had a main harem in the capital, smaller collections in various regional palaces, and even traveling harems that moved with him during his constant military campaigns and inspection tours. The guy literally built new cities just to house his romantic interests. The most famous was Luoyang, which he reconstructed as a massive palace complex. The harem quarters alone covered several square miles and included artificial lakes, mountains, and forests. It was like Disneyland, but for one man's dating life. But here's where the story gets really wild. Yang didn't just collect these women randomly. He had specific recruitment strategies. He sent agents throughout the empire looking for the most beautiful, talented, and intelligent women. We're talking about a systematic, empire-wide talent search that made modern casting calls look like casual encounters. The recruitment process was intense. Potential harem members underwent months of evaluation, including tests of their artistic abilities, intelligence, political knowledge, and yes, physical attributes. Only the absolute cream of the crop made it to the imperial level. This wasn't just about looks. Yang wanted women who could hold conversations about poetry, politics, military strategy, and economics. And the women. Many of them were brilliant. Take Consort Xiao, who became one of Yang's most influential partners. She wasn't just beautiful, she was a master poet, a skilled musician, and a shrewd political advisor. She helped Yang design several major policy initiatives, and reportedly had more influence on government decisions than most of his male ministers. Then there was Lady Chen, a former princess from a conquered kingdom, who became Yang's military strategist. She designed fortification systems, planned siege tactics, and even led troops in battle. Yang was so impressed with her skills that he made her a general, while she was still technically just a concubine. The daily schedule was like something out of a fantasy novel. Yang would wake up in a different wing of the palace each morning, spend the day with various administrative and military duties. Then evening would begin what palace staff called the rotation. A different woman, or sometimes multiple women, every single night. Palace servants developed elaborate systems to manage this complexity. There were scheduling secretaries whose only job was organizing Yang's romantic calendar. Color-coded silk ribbons indicated which women were available, which were pregnant, which were in their educational phases, and which had been selected for specific evenings. The preparation alone required hundreds of staff members. Each selected woman would spend hours getting ready. Elaborate makeup, specially designed clothing, briefings on current political topics the emperor might want to discuss, even coaching on conversation topics he'd been interested in lately. But here's the part that really shows you how this was more than just ancient hedonism. Yang used these intimate encounters for intelligence gathering. He would pump his partners for information about their home regions, their family's political connections, local economic conditions, and potential security threats. The bedroom became an extension of the intelligence service. The numbers became so legendary that other emperors started competing. It was like an ancient arms race, but instead of weapons, it was women. Palace records from the Tang dynasty, which followed the Sui, show that later emperors explicitly tried to exceed Yang's totals. And the craziest part, Yang genuinely seemed to believe this was part of his imperial duty. So you think Emperor Yang was intense? Hold my ancient wine cup, because we're about to meet some rulers who made his 3,000 women look like amateur hour. The competition for most excessive royal love life spans continents and centuries, and the stories will make your head spin. Let's start with King Solomon, who takes the crown for officially documented romantic excess. According to biblical and historical records, this guy had 700 wives and 300 concubines. That's 1,000 women total. But here's the kicker. Solomon was strategic about it. Each marriage was a political alliance. Each concubine represented a different tribal or regional connection. The man wasn't just collecting women. He was building a diplomatic network that spanned the entire known world. Solomon's harem was like the United Nations of ancient dating. He had Egyptian princesses, Ethiopian queens, Arabian tribal leaders' daughters, and representatives from every major kingdom within 1,000 miles of Jerusalem. When foreign dignitaries visited, they weren't just meeting with Israel's king. They were seeing their own people in positions of honor and influence. But the logistics? Absolutely bonkers. Solomon built an entire complex just to house his wives, with separate quarters for different cultural groups, because mixing dietary restrictions, religious practices, and cultural traditions was a nightmare even 3,000 years ago. The guy had to employ cultural consultants just to avoid accidentally offending someone's wife during dinner. Now let's hop over to India and meet Maharaja Bhupinder Singh of Patiala, who ruled in the early 20th century. This absolute madman had 365 wives, one for each day of the year. He literally planned his marriage calendar like a daily vitamin routine. And we're not talking about symbolic marriages either. Palace records show he maintained active relationships with all of them. Singh's approach was methodical to the point of being ridiculous. He had secretaries whose only job was scheduling quality time with each wife, ensuring nobody felt neglected. The man color-coded his calendar. Different colors for different wives, with complex rotation systems that would make modern app developers weep with envy. The palace complex covered several square miles and included 365 separate apartments, each designed according to the specific wife's cultural background and personal preferences. Singh literally employed teams of interior designers, chefs, musicians, and entertainers just to keep everyone happy. The monthly entertainment budget alone could have funded a small country's military. But wait, there's more. Let's travel to Morocco and meet Moulay Ismail, the sultan who makes everyone else look like monogamous saints. This guy claimed to have fathered over 1,200 children. 1,200! Modern geneticists have actually studied his claims and concluded they're probably accurate. The man was basically a one-person population boom. Ismail's harem contained an estimated 4,000 women at its peak. 4,000! That's not a harem, that's a small city. And unlike some rulers who just collected women like trophies, Ismail was apparently genuinely committed to spending time with as many as possible. Palace records show he maintained a rotation schedule that would challenge modern logistics experts. The economic impact was staggering. Feeding, clothing, housing, and entertaining 4,000 women required a dedicated bureaucracy. Ismail employed over 25,000 people just to manage his harem: guards, servants, teachers, doctors, chefs, entertainers, and administrators. The harem had its own postal system, its own court system for resolving disputes, and its own economic advisors managing the massive budget. Then there's the Ottoman Sultan Ibrahim I, known as Ibrahim the Mad, who took royal excess to levels that would make modern dictators blush. Ibrahim was so obsessed with expanding his harem that he sent agents across Europe, Asia, and Africa specifically to find the most extraordinary women possible. He wanted at least one representative from every known culture and ethnic group. Ibrahim's harem included women from over 40 different countries and cultural backgrounds. The language barrier alone was insane. Palace staff spoke dozens of languages just to communicate with everyone. The Sultan employed teams of translators, cultural consultants, and etiquette experts to navigate the complex social dynamics. But here's where Ibrahim really went off the rails. He started offering massive rewards to anyone who could find him women with unique physical characteristics. Albino women, unusually tall women, women with rare eye colors, identical twins, women who could sing in multiple octaves. It became like collecting rare Pokemon cards, but with people. The competition between these rulers wasn't just personal, it was international. When one emperor expanded his harem, neighboring rulers felt pressure to match or exceed those numbers. It became a bizarre form of diplomatic one-upmanship, with royal marriages and harem sizes serving as indicators of national power and prestige. Some historians argue that these massive harems were actually early forms of international diplomacy and cultural exchange. By bringing together women from dozens of different backgrounds, these rulers created unprecedented opportunities for cross-cultural learning and political networking. The downside? The competition eventually became unsustainable, contributing to economic problems that weakened several major empires. Okay, so we've talked about the crazy numbers and the legendary excess, but let's get real for a minute. How did these massive operations actually function? Because running a harem with thousands of women wasn't just about unlimited wealth and royal privilege. It was like managing a corporation, a university, and a small city all at the same time. The organizational structure was mind-blowing. Take the Ottoman harem, which we have the best records for. At the top was the Valid Sultan, the emperor's mother, who wielded more practical power than most government ministers. Below her were the official wives, then the favored concubines, then the regular concubines, then the trainees, and finally the servants. Each level had its own quarters, its own staff, and its own complex set of rules and privileges. But here's what nobody talks about. The education system was absolutely revolutionary for its time. Young women entering the harem didn't just learn to look pretty and wait around. They received education that was often superior to what most men in the empire could access. We're talking about advanced courses in mathematics, literature, multiple languages, music theory, political science, economics, and even medicine. The imperial school within the Ottoman harem was like Harvard, Yale, and Juilliard combined. Women studied Arabic, Persian, Turkish, and often several European languages. They learned to play complex musical instruments, mastered various forms of poetry and literature, and received training in court etiquette that was essentially a master class in psychology and political manipulation. The daily schedule was intense. Morning hours were dedicated to formal education, language lessons, mathematical studies, religious instruction. Afternoons focused on arts and culture, music, dance, painting, and crafts. Evenings were for physical training, including various forms of exercise that kept women healthy and strong. This wasn't about creating passive ornaments, it was about developing well-rounded, intellectually capable individuals. The hierarchy wasn't just about who got to spend time with the Sultan. It was a complex merit-based system where women could advance through intelligence, skill, creativity, and political savvy. A peasant girl could potentially rise to become one of the most powerful people in the empire if she was smart and determined enough. Take the position of Cadin, the Sultan's official wives. These weren't just ceremonial roles. Cadins managed enormous budgets, supervised construction projects, ran charitable organizations, and often served as unofficial ambassadors to foreign courts. They were essentially cabinet-level government officials who happened to also be married to the ruler. The economic system within harems was fascinating. Women at higher levels received generous stipends and were allowed to invest in trade ventures, real estate, and various business enterprises. Some became incredibly wealthy in their own right. The records show harem women funding major construction projects, establishing schools and hospitals, and even lending money to government operations. The healthcare system was remarkably advanced. Large harems had their own hospitals with trained physicians, surgeons, and specialists. The Ottoman harem hospital included a maternity ward, a surgical suite, and even an early form of mental health treatment. Women received regular medical checkups, specialized diets, and exercise programs designed to maintain their health and longevity. Security was like something out of a modern thriller movie. Multiple layers of guards, complex identification systems, and elaborate protocols for anyone entering or leaving harem quarters. But the security wasn't just about keeping people out. It was about maintaining the complex social order within the harem itself. The communication system was incredibly sophisticated. Harems developed their own languages, coded systems for passing messages, and informal networks that could spread information across the empire faster than official government channels. Women in the harem often knew about political developments, military movements, and economic changes before most government officials. Conflict resolution was handled through formal court systems within the harem itself. Disputes between women were adjudicated by senior harem officials, with elaborate procedures for investigating complaints, hearing testimony, and issuing punishments or corrections. It was like having a complete legal system operating within the larger imperial structure. The reproductive management aspect was extremely clinical and organized. Palace physicians tracked women's cycles, managed pregnancies with advanced medical care, and maintained detailed records of all births. The goal was ensuring healthy offspring, while managing the complex politics around succession and inheritance. Food service was like running dozens of restaurants simultaneously. Different cultural groups within the harem required different dietary accommodations. Islamic halal requirements, Hindu vegetarian needs, various regional cuisines, and special dietary restrictions. The harem kitchens employed hundreds of specialized cooks, food testers, and nutritional experts. Entertainment was a massive industry unto itself. Harems employed orchestras, dance troupes, storytellers, poets, and various other performers. But many of the women were also accomplished artists themselves, creating music, literature, and visual arts that influenced cultural development throughout the empire. The retirement system was surprisingly progressive. Women who aged out of active harem life weren't just discarded. They often became teachers, administrators, or advisors. Some were given estates and pensions that allowed them to live comfortably for the rest of their lives. Now here's where our story takes a dark turn. Because all this incredible excess came with a price tag that eventually bankrupted empires and toppled dynasties. The very harems that symbolized ultimate power became the anchor that dragged some of history's greatest civilizations into economic and political collapse. Let's start with the numbers that'll make your accountant weep. The Ottoman Sultan's harem at its peak consumed roughly 30% of the entire imperial budget. 30%! Imagine if a modern government spent 1/3 of its national budget on one person's romantic life. The maintenance costs were absolutely staggering. Food, clothing, entertainment, education, medical care, security, and housing for thousands of people, plus the massive support staff required to keep everything running. Emperor Yang, our 3,000 women champion, literally spent his empire into oblivion. The Sui dynasty, which should have lasted for centuries based on its military and economic power, collapsed after just 37 years. Historians directly link this rapid decline to Yang's excessive spending on harem expansion and maintenance. The guy built so many palace complexes to house his women that he drained the imperial treasury and triggered massive tax increases that sparked nationwide rebellions. But the economic damage was just the beginning. The political consequences were even more devastating. Massive harems created succession nightmares that tore empires apart from the inside. When a ruler has dozens of wives and hundreds of children, determining legitimate succession becomes impossible. Different factions formed around different wives and their children, leading to civil wars that lasted for generations. The Ottoman Empire experienced this firsthand during what historians call the Sultanate of Women period. While some powerful harem women proved to be excellent rulers, the constant fighting between different factions within the harem created political instability that lasted for over a century. Brothers killed brothers, mothers poisoned rivals' children, and entire royal bloodlines were wiped out in succession disputes. The social costs were equally brutal. To maintain these massive harems, empires had to systematically remove young women from the general population. This created severe demographic imbalances in many regions. Some provinces lost entire generations of young women to imperial collection, leaving communities unable to maintain their own populations through natural reproduction. The psychological toll on the rulers themselves was devastating. Historical records show that many emperors with massive harems suffered from what we'd now recognize as severe anxiety, depression, and paranoia. The constant pressure to maintain relationships with hundreds or thousands of women, combined with the complex political dynamics within harems, drove several rulers to complete mental breakdown. Emperor Ibrahim the Mad, whom we met earlier, is a perfect example. His obsession with harem expansion became so extreme that he neglected all other aspects of governing. He spent days at a time locked in harem quarters, refusing to meet with government officials or military commanders. The empire literally ran itself, while the Sultan was lost in his romantic fantasies. The military consequences were particularly ironic. These rulers built massive harems partly to demonstrate their power and virility, but maintaining them required so many resources that it actually weakened their military capabilities. Armies went without pay, so harem women could have silk clothing. Fortifications crumbled while new harem quarters were constructed. The Mughal Empire in India provides a clear example. Emperor Shah Jahan, famous for building the Taj Mahal, spent so much on his various romantic obsessions that the empire's military began using outdated equipment and couldn't afford to modernize their weapons or training. This military weakness directly contributed to British colonial expansion in India. Religious and cultural backlash became another major problem. Many of these excessive harems violated the religious and cultural values of the populations being governed. Islamic scholars criticized Ottoman sultans for exceeding the religiously permitted number of wives. Hindu populations in Mughal territories resented having their daughters taken for imperial harems. Christian communities in various empires saw massive harems as evidence of moral corruption. The administrative burden became overwhelming. Managing thousands of women required entire bureaucracies dedicated solely to harem affairs. The Ottoman Empire employed over 40,000 people just in harem-related positions at its peak. That's 40,000 people who weren't contributing to economic development, technological advancement, or military defense. International diplomatic problems arose when foreign powers began viewing these massive harems as signs of moral degeneracy and political weakness. European ambassadors wrote detailed reports describing Ottoman and Mughal harems as evidence that these empires were internally corrupted and vulnerable to conquest. The health consequences were severe and well documented. Sexually transmitted diseases spread rapidly through large harems, affecting not just the women, but also the rulers themselves. Several emperors died from what historical medical records suggest were STD-related complications. Perhaps most tragically, the very women these harems were supposedly designed to honor often became prisoners of the system. As harems grew larger, individual women received less attention and fewer opportunities for advancement. Many spent their entire lives in luxury, but also in isolation, never able to leave the harem or formed relationships outside the imperial system. The end game was always the same: empire-killing expenses, political instability, and social collapse. So, what's the final verdict on these incredible, excessive, and ultimately unsustainable institutions? The legacy of royal harems is way more complex than just powerful men behaving badly, though there was definitely plenty of that. On one hand, harems were some of the most progressive educational institutions of their time. The Ottoman Imperial School produced women who were more educated than most university graduates in Europe. These institutions preserved and transmitted knowledge across cultures, languages, and generations. Some of the most important literary works, musical compositions, and artistic innovations of the medieval period came directly from harem culture. The political influence was undeniable. Women like Roxolana in the Ottoman Empire, who rose from slavery to become one of the most powerful political figures in Europe, proved that merit and intelligence could overcome even the most restrictive social systems. Several harem women effectively ruled vast empires, implementing policies that improved education, healthcare, and economic development for millions of people. But let's be honest about the dark side. These were still fundamentally oppressive systems built on the objectification and control of women. The fact that some women managed to gain power within these systems doesn't erase the reality that thousands of others lived constrained lives, cut off from family, and outside relationships existing primarily for one man's pleasure and political convenience. The economic lessons are particularly relevant today. These historical examples provide clear evidence of what happens when personal excess becomes so extreme that it undermines institutional stability. Modern economists study these cases as examples of how concentrated wealth and resource misallocation can destroy even the most powerful civilizations. The demographic impact was severe and long-lasting. Regions that lost significant numbers of young women to imperial harems experienced population declines that took generations to recover. Some areas never fully recovered their previous population levels, fundamentally altering the ethnic and cultural composition of entire regions. But perhaps the most important lesson is about power and its corrupting influence. These weren't just stories about ancient perverts with too much money. They were examples of how unlimited power inevitably leads to destructive excess. When there are no checks on behavior, when every desire can be instantly gratified, even reasonable people can spiral into destructive patterns. The psychological profiles of these rulers show remarkably similar patterns. Initial success and confidence gradually gave way to paranoia, obsession, and complete disconnection from reality. The very harems that were supposed to demonstrate their ultimate power became prisons that isolated them from genuine human connection and political reality. Modern parallels are uncomfortable, but undeniable. Today's billionaires and political leaders may not maintain harems, but patterns of excessive consumption, resource hoarding, and disconnection from normal human experience echo these historical examples. The specific manifestations change, but the fundamental dynamics of power, excess, and eventual self-destruction remain remarkably consistent. The technological and cultural innovations that emerged from harem culture continue to influence us today. Musical instruments, architectural styles, literary forms, and even culinary traditions that developed in these environments spread throughout the world and remain part of global culture. Perhaps most importantly, these stories remind us that history is never simple. The same institutions that produced incredible art, literature, and cultural achievement also perpetuated oppression and inequality. The women who gained unprecedented power and influence within these systems were still trapped by them. The rulers who lived out ultimate fantasies often died isolated, paranoid, and universally hated. The lesson isn't that power is inherently evil, or that luxury necessarily corrupts. It's that sustainable success requires balance, limitation, and connection to broader human values. The emperors who slept with thousands of women achieved the ultimate expression of one particular form of power, but they lost everything else that makes life meaningful: genuine relationships, respect, legacy, and often their empires themselves. In the end, these harems tell us as much about human nature as they do about history.